Hello everyone and welcome to my Elden Ring Sorceries tier list. Something to note before I begin is I am going to be ordering these based off of both PvE and PvP performance. I will be speaking a little bit further in depth on what I think about both of those aspects of each one, but the overall ranking is going to be based on both. So we're just going to go ahead and start off with the top of the list. These are all in alphabetical order, which means we have what is, in my opinion, one of the strongest spells in the game right up front. Adula's Moonblade. Absolutely disgusting spell in PvE. You can hit with both the sword portion and the projectile portion, meaning that this just pumps out disgusting amounts of damage, especially when amped by the Snow Witch hat. Just absolutely disgusting in PvE. For bigger enemies, like for example the Fire Giant, the blade and the projectile can hit multiple parts of his body, stacking even further. For example, both legs or both arms and his chest. Which means this thing, on even an unoptimized build, can pump out maybe 5,000, 6,000 damage per cast, which is just gross. In PvP, it's a little less useful. It does have a little bit of a slow startup. However, because it has the blade and the projectile portion, it can be pretty reasonably used to roll catch, especially if someone's medium rolling. And it can be used as a good punish if someone tries to charge up something that's really slow, like a slow weapon art like the Sword of Night and Flame, or if someone tries to really foolishly use the Azure Comet in PvP. There are some PvE players who are doing co-op who will try to pull that out on you, and you might trade a little bit, but you'll way out damage because the Azure Comet's strength is damage over time, and this is definitely a burst spell. So overall, definitely going to give it an S rating. Moving on to Ambush Shard. I think I'm going to give this one a B. It's not the most incredibly useful spell, but it does work. It costs a little more mana than some other spells that fill the same niche, so I can't put it too high, I think. Its main use is that because it comes from behind, it can poke people through shields. Unfortunately for PvP, the dodge timing is exactly the same as any other projectile spell, like any of the Glintstone shards or Comet. So it's really easy to dodge. It doesn't do that much damage, and it's in PvE. It's just entirely outshadowed by Magic Glintblade because you can pull people past Magic Glintblade and have it fire into their backs, which does more damage than this for lower mana cost. But with that being said, even though it is outclassed, it's not an incredibly useless spell, and it is boosted by the Staff of Loss, which is interesting, and there are builds that could be done around that. Moving on. Ancient Death Rancor Call. I'm going to give this one a I think. No, I'm going to give it a B. The reason I'm going to give this one a B is in PvE, it's just not too useful. It doesn't do that much damage, although the tracking is pretty decent. The cast time is very long, though, and for that long cast time, you could be putting out a lot more damage with many other spells. In PvP, it's slightly more useful, and when we get to the standard Death Rancor Call, we'll see why I think it is one of the best PvP spells in the game. However, this one, although it does more damage, fires a lot more slowly, which leaves you open for a lot longer. Currently, the PvP meta is very aggressive. People like to get in your face with Bloodhound Dash or Tower Shield and an S-Stock and just stand right in your face and attack you. So getting off a slow attack like this isn't always going to happen, and the damage trade-off just isn't there. Kind of like before with Ambush Shard, it's still relatively useful, just, not quite in the top tiers. Briars of Punishment is essentially the magic equivalent of Honed Lightning Bolt, whereas Honed Lightning Bolt just comes down from above right over the target. The Briars of Punishment will come from below at a target. It does a small amount of AoE damage and inflicts bleed, which is very useful. Bleed's very strong in Elden Ring. It is a little slow. It's a little slow to cast, a little slow for the damage to come out. But in PvE, that doesn't necessarily matter against bosses or groups of enemies. You're probably going to hit them with it anyway. In PvP, it's not too great. However, there are some uses for it. Because it is slightly slower, but not too slow, it can be used for roll catching scenarios, or even just to put pressure on an enemy and force them to dodge using their stamina. It can synergize pretty well with a build that is speccing more completely into bleed. So overall, pretty decent. I'll give it a B. Briars of Sin. Briars of Sin gets a C. Briars of Sin is kind of a doo-doo spell. The AoE on it is not great. It doesn't do that much damage. It does inflict bleed, which, as we spoke about with Briars of Punishment, is a good trait to have because bleed is so strong in Elden Ring. However, the AoE is just so small, and it leaves you open to any sort of ranged attack from an enemy in PvP, or even the bigger enemies in PvE just have enough range to go straight past it and smack you out of it. It can be used. It is just not incredibly useful. Haima's Cannon. Haima's Cannon gets an A. This is a very interesting spell. It's outrageously slow. Unbelievably slow. If you try to cast this in any sort of duel or close counters scenario in PvP, you are getting caught out. This is not going to do anything. However, it does good damage and it has great knockback. In invasion scenarios, you can use the Cannon of Haima to knock people off ledges. You can use it to, honestly, even if you don't knock them off a ledge, if you knock them on the ground, that gives you a chance for an OTG. Or some sort of wake-up attack. In PvE, it's one of the biggest AoE spells in the game. This is great for knocking out crowds of enemies. From a really far range, too. It's one of the longest ranged attacks as well. Honestly, fairly useful. Not so much in duels, but for invasions and PvE, great spell. Karian Greatsword is up next, and I think I'm going to give this one a B as well. We've got a lot of Bs. I think that'll be a trend in the rest of this tier list, but we'll see. Karian Greatsword, decent damage. Little slow on the cast time. One of the great things about it, at least for PvE, is that it seems to almost always stagger enemies. Every time. So even if it seems like you're going to get a trade-off, if you are casting Karian Greatsword and it hits them first, especially if it's a charged cast, they'll stagger. And you just get free damage. It's pretty decent for that. It's got a nice sweeping arc, which means if there's a crowd of enemies in front of you, you're probably going to hit them with it. Unfortunately, it is outclassed by a Duelist Moonblade in every single way. A Duelist Moonblade has the projectile hit. It's faster. and it has slightly more range. Um, oh, and it does more damage. It's just a Duelist Moonblade is just better Carian Greatsword. And for that reason, I'm going to have to give Carian Greatsword a B just for being outclassed, even though it is pretty useful in PvE specifically. In PvP, unlike Adula's Moonblade, it does not have the same roll catch potential because it doesn't have the projectile, and the cast time is a little bit slower, means it's hard to combo into anything or use as a roll catch. So, not great there either. Moving on, we have Carian Phalanx. I think I'm going to give this one an A. This is a very strong spell, actually. It has decent tracking. It does pretty good damage. And the cast time is surprisingly quick for how much damage it does. I don't know if anybody listening to this is familiar with the backstep tactics that you can use to delay the actual damage cast of any of these homing Silmass or Phalanx abilities. But if you turn your character around and backstep towards someone, you can delay it going off, which can lead to some really interesting mix-ups in PvP especially in duel scenarios where things can be a little less frantic, and you can kind of time your shots a little more. Another great thing about it is the mana cost is not very high. You can kind of just cast this on repeat and it does good damage. So you can set up some interesting timings with Carian Phalanx going off while casting other spells in PvP. In PvE, it's just a decent damage spell for a pretty low mana cost. You can stack spells with this. For example, if you cast Carian Phalanx from out of range, then run up to an enemy and cast another spell, like Crystal Burst, for example, you can stack the damage of 2 spells at once, and that can be pretty devastating in PvE. And for that reason, we're going to give it an A. Pretty useful spell, worth adding to your arsenal. Carian Piercer is maybe the premier spell to roll catch people in PvP. You can combo it out of almost any hit. Carian Slicer, Glintblade Phalanx, Adula's Moonblade if you hit that. Anything that staggers, you can combo into Carian Piercer and possibly get a roll catch out of it if the enemy isn't ready for it. Very, very strong spell in PvP, worth picking up for that alone. In PvE, it is still pretty strong. It does good damage. It has good range. You can get caught out using it sometimes. I think you'll find in PvE it is easier to trade than get a clean hit off. But even if you trade, the damage on it is good enough that it's just worth using a lot of the times. The spell is good. The spell is just good. Maybe not the strongest PvE spell, but strong enough in PvP that it gets a pretty strong spot in A. Carian Slicer is very strong. It is the melee replacement for any pure caster. It staggers. It does good damage. It can combo into Carian Piercer for PvP, as mentioned before, with using Carian Piercer as a roll catch. It's quick. Honestly, the only downside is it has kind of a short range, but the fact that you can use it running, rolling, it combos into itself, and it does good damage and staggers alongside that, it's just good. It's a good spell. If you are running a pure caster in PvP or PvE, highly recommend picking up Carian Slicer. It is that good. It takes its spot next to Adula's Moonblade in the S. Next we have Collapsing Stars, which I think I'm gonna give an A. Collapsing Stars is very strong, actually. And one of the better gravity sorceries. You can think of it kind of like the equivalent of Stars of Ruin, but for gravity sorceries. It does have a pretty long cast time, but in PvE in particular, this just decimates enemies. It, especially if it's something that can be pulled towards you, as in, not a big boss enemy that's immune to that effect. Very, very strong. They'll get hit with a lot of them, especially if they don't have any inbuilt dodge in their AI, like Melania or the Bloodhound Knight, or something hit like that, by a bunch of these. And it's going to do good damage, and it's going to stagger them, and it's going to let you do even more damage. Very, very strong if you can get it off. In PvP, somewhat less useful. It doesn't have the same amount of projectiles as Stars of Ruin, which we're going to talk about later. And the cast time is a little bit longer, so I can't put it in the S tier for that, although there are some situations where if the opponent is playing kind of far off and you're not going to get punished for it, you can get a cast of this off, and it will do some good damage. Comet Azure. I know a lot of people love this for PvE, and it can entirely invalidate some bosses when you have the right setup. With that in mind, I am going to give it an A, just because when you have the right setup, when an enemy is distracted, if they don't dodge, you can just sit there and pump out DPS and kill a boss before it can do anything. This will destroy Niall or O'Neill. This will destroy Mog, the Lord of Blood. This will even destroy Radon if you can catch him while he's not moving. It is pretty disgusting. However, the reason it is not getting an S is because this is dog useless in PvP. You will never hit someone with this spell unless you're ganking and they're distracted. It is bad. If someone tries to pull this off in PvP on you, just run up and hit them. There's nothing they can do. They're locked in place. They can't even change the direction. So if you move slightly out of the way of the beam, what are they going to do? Absolutely nothing. It is strength in PvE alone that gets it an A in this ranking. Next, we have Comet, which I think I'm going to give a B. It is the Crystal Soul Spear equivalent, I guess you could call it. Maybe Soul Ray for the Demon Souls fans. It does good damage. It casts pretty fast. Unfortunately, you're just not going to hit anybody with it. In PvE, there are a lot of bosses and a lot of enemies that are programmed to dodge when you cast a spell. And that dodge will completely avoid the spell. And you just wasted 26 mana. It's just not going to happen. In PvP, kind of the same thing. It's really obvious. You can see it coming, and all they have to do is roll once, and they're not going to get hit at all. This isn't even a stamina drain on them. With that said, I didn't put this in C, I put it in B, and that is because the damage is pretty good, and against bosses and enemies in PvE that aren't programmed to dodge, this can do some good work, and it's worth picking up for that. Crystal Burst. I'm going to give this one a C. It's, to be honest, the Crystal Burst just gets outclassed later. It has outrageously short range. If you are not in someone's face, this is not going to land. It doesn't do that much damage either. You're probably not going to hit somebody in PvP because they can roll through it or just roll back and they're out of range even if they mistime the roll. In PvE, it does have a kind of a shotgun effect, so if you get right up in a big boss, it can do some damage. But for the mana cost, there are just better options. Honestly, I would rather cast Carian Slicer twice than Crystal Burst once. So, not useless in PvE, but not very good. Crystal Release. I'm gonna give this a C as well. In PvE, it just doesn't hit as much as you want it to. The projectiles don't home the way you think they would. In PvP, you can get some use out of it. If the enemy sees it and their reaction is to run away, it can get you some space. Maybe if you need to get another mana flask off, a cerulean flask to recover some mana, that can be helpful. But unfortunately, like I said, the PvP meta right now is very aggressive. People like to be in your face, and if they see you casting this, they're probably just going to walk up and hit you. And there's no reason to take free damage like that. Like Crystal Burst and Briars of Sin, not useless, but also not very good. Landing it in C. Crystal Torrent. Crystal Torrent's interesting because it just got buffed in 1.03. And now it's kind of a poor man's Comet Azure, actually. Pretty decent in PvE, to be entirely honest. If you can hit an enemy with all of the shards that it shoots out, if the enemy is big enough, if you're close enough, and you can just hold down the button and keep casting, pretty strong. It does some decent damage. In PvP, you're probably not going to hit anybody with this. Just like Comet Azure, you cannot move, you cannot aim while casting this thing. If someone moves out of the way, they are not getting hit with this attack. It's a little depressing, to be entirely honest. Do not try this in PvP if you value your sanity. Eternal Darkness. This is an interesting one, actually. I almost want to give it an S because of how interesting it is, because this can just completely invalidate some characters in PvP and some bosses in PvE. I think I'm going to give this one an A. As long as you are standing underneath the dark space that this creates, no sorcery will hit you. That's a pretty strong effect when you consider how good sorcery is in Elden Ring. If you are against a couple mages in an invasion, casting this will just make them waste their mana. And for that reason alone, it's pretty strong. If you somehow manage to get this before Renala, if you are braving the Caelid swamps to get this before Renala, this invalidates the Renala phase 2. She will not be able to hit you with any of her spells. You don't even have to worry about dodging it. Unfortunately, for the rest of PvE, it's less useful because it's only good against casters. There are only so many things this works on. It doesn't work on Radahn, it doesn't work on Morgott, it doesn't work on Radagon, it doesn't work on any of the big bosses. As far as I'm aware, the only big boss it works on is Renala, but that niche use is still pretty strong. And like I said, in PvP, it does have its uses as well, so I think I'm going to put it in A. Fia's Mist. I think this one's going to get a D. It just doesn't do a whole lot, to be entirely honest. It doesn't do damage on its own, and it does inflict the instant kill debuff, death. However, you're just not going to hit anybody with this in PvP. If you cast this cloud and they see it, all they have to do is not stand in it. I mean, especially for the mana cost, I would rather just cast a spell and kill them with that. Founding Reign of Stars. This is an interesting one. Based on the other primeval sorceries, I think you would expect this to be good, but it's not great. It does a little bit of damage and an AoE around you. I think the big drawback to this is when you cast it, it only comes down around you. Unfortunately, you can't cast it over a different enemy. Kind of the same thing with Fia's Mist in PvP. People can just leave. They don't have to stand in it. And even if they do, if they hit you, you get out-traded. For PvE, if the boss is big enough, for example, the Putrid Tree Spirit doesn't move around a lot, you could just cast that and he'll take damage for a while. The Elden Beast, actually, can get hit by this a lot. Pretty decent for that. But for the most part, I would say not worth the mana cost. You know, actually, I'm even going to put it in C. I'm going to put it in the top of C, though. Freezing Mist. Freezing Mist, kind of like Fia's Mist, slightly better. I'm going to give Freezing Mist a C, and that's because you can cast this on a boss, and they'll just stand in it because it doesn't do any damage. Decent for that. In PvP, you can do some obscuring shenanigans. When you charge cast it, it becomes pretty hard to see through. You can cast spells from inside of that cloud, and for that, it's interesting. It can work. Unfortunately, the Frost proc is probably not going to go off. People can just, like I said with Fia's Mist and Founding Rain of Stars, people just walk out of it. It's unfortunate, but that is what it is. Frozen Armament, kind of an interesting spell. It does not scale with your magic at all. However, it does give you the Frost Affliction on your weapon. The unfortunate thing is, it costs mana. And you can just use Frost Grease on your weapon. And it does the exact same thing. What is the purpose of this? It lasts a little longer than the Grease. Against enemies, pretty useful. Frost does a lot of damage, especially against bosses, because it does a percentage of total health, just like Bleed. And it has the additional effect of lowering defense once the Frost proc hits. However, I don't know why you wouldn't save that mana to cast something that does damage. And for that reason, I'm going to give it a C. Gavel of Haima. This is kind of like the canon of Haima, except instead of having incredible range, it has no range. That sounds about as good as it is. This is going to go in C. It takes a long time to cast. It has no range. The only good thing about it is that the AoE is quite large. So if you do manage to get it off in PvP or PvE, you can catch some enemies out with it because the AoE is just so unbelievably large. I believe in PvP it takes 2 rolls to get out of the AoE. And granted, they have plenty of time to do it because of how slow this cast time is. But if they don't recognize it in time, you can maybe get a catch with this. In PvE, I don't even know what I would use this for. Against a group of enemies, I would rather use a Duelist Moonblade or even Carian Greatsword. Or, 1,000 other things to do AoE damage. Gilmir's Fury, one of the few lava sorceries. It's interesting, to be honest. We're gonna give this a high C, I think. And the reason is because, not that this does a lot of damage, because it doesn't, and not that this is quick to cast, because it isn't, but it does leave lava on the ground. And a lot of people in PvP see an area of damage on the ground and say, I am just not going to step in this. I'm going to avoid this at all costs. And because of that, you can make people run around in weird mazes of lava. And that can be interesting. That can disrupt their movement. It can dissuade them from being aggressive. So it can be useful for that. Kind of similarly against large mobs of enemies in PvE, you can cast this and catch a couple of them out with it. Or at least force them to run through the lava and take some extra damage. Other than those niche situations, though, I wouldn't say that Gilmir's Fury is useful. So it's going to get a C. Glintblade Phalanx, this is going to go in B, simply for being a worse version of Carian Phalanx. Everything I said about Carian Phalanx applies to Glintblade Phalanx, except Glintblade Phalanx is worse. Still worth picking up, especially if your build doesn't have the intelligence requirement for Carian Phalanx. Moving on quickly, we have Glintstone Arc. This is going to get an upper C, I think. Its only real use is against mobs of enemies that are grouping up on you. It does pierce, so you can catch a lot of them with it at once. It doesn't do an incredible amount of damage, but it does some. It can be decent for some wave clear if you do not have any. In PvP, I don't know why you would try to use this. It doesn't do that much damage. It's not very quick. It's pretty easy to dodge. Not super useful in general. Glintstone Comet Shard. This is kind of the same thing as Comet, except I'm gonna say it's better. The damage is surprisingly pretty comparable. It's decent compared to Comet. However, this costs a significant amount less mana. Everything I said about Comet applies to Glintstone Comet Shard as far as PvP is concerned, so still pretty useless against enemies who have AI that cause them to dodge whenever you cast a spell. Also pretty useless. Anything else, this is decent and worth picking up. Glintstone Ice Crag. This is a spell very close to my heart, and maybe I'm a little biased, but I'm going to give this one a low A, because this is very strong for PvE. It is quick, it inflicts frost, and it does pretty good damage. It is easily comparable to Glintstone Comet Shard, slightly less than Comet, but way better mana cost. It is just very strong in PvE against enemies that don't dodge. Or if you have a situation where you know the enemy isn't going to move. For example, when Melania goes into phase 2 and she does her big flower explosion, you can't really do anything in melee range other than wait. It's a great opportunity to cast a couple Glintstone Ice Crags, get a frost proc off. It means she takes extra damage when you are able to attack in melee range. Very strong spell. Would recommend for PvE. For PvP, you're probably not going to hit anybody with this. Don't use it. Glintstone Pebble. It can be used to chip some health off of enemies. It does a little bit. Entirely outclassed by a spell that we'll see later, but its main strength, honestly, is just that the mana cost is low. It's very useful in situations in PvE specifically, where if you don't do quite enough damage to one shot, this will finish them off. So it does have its use. In PvP, you're not going to hit anybody with it. Moving on, we have Glintstone Stars. I'm going to give this one a high C. We're actually going to move it to the top of C. The reason this is going at the top of C is because this is the first spell that counters AI dodges. This home's strong enough that it will still hit the enemy. And although its damage per FP is not great, that makes it useful. The reason it's going in C is because there are two other star spells that both outclass this. In PvP, less useful. Once again, pretty easy to dodge. All three projectiles hit at the same time, means one well-timed dodge can dodge through all three. Next we have Gravity Well. Pretty interesting spell, actually. I like this one a lot. We're going to put this at the top of B. The reason this is useful is because its cast time is not too long, and it does some interesting stagger effects in PvE, especially against flying enemies. It can just knock them straight out of the air on the ground, which is pretty strong by itself. If it hits the enemy, it also pulls them towards you with a stagger, which can lead to some combo opportunities, like with Carian Slicer, or if you're carrying a weapon in your other hand. It has a strange movement pattern where it's slow at first and then speeds up. If you're against an enemy in PvP who is not super comfortable with that timing, you can catch them out with it, especially if you're pressuring them in other ways. With that said, it is a single projectile. Once you get used to the timing, it's not too hard to dodge, so it's not incredibly useful in PvP, but it still gets a high B for its use in the rest of the game. Next, we have Great Blade Phalanx. I'm going to put this one at the bottom of A. This is kind of interesting because it should be a straight upgrade to Carian Phalanx, but in my opinion it's not. It does slightly more damage, but it costs a lot more mana, almost 50% more mana. To me, the damage increase is just not worth it. The cast time is also a lot longer. It is still a straight upgrade over the standard Phalanx. However, in my opinion, it doesn't do enough to outshine Carian Phalanx in both PvE and PvP. Still a decent spell, though, and worth using. Great Glintstone Shard. This is going to go in C. We're going to put it behind Gelmir's Fury, because it doesn't do the damage of Comet or Glintstone Comet Shard. It doesn't have the low mana cost of Glintstone Pebble or a Swift Glintstone Shard, it's somewhere in the middle. And in that middle spot, it is just worse. Great Oracular Bubble. This is kind of interesting, actually. This spell launches a slow-moving large bubble. In PvP, this is not incredible. It is very, very slow. It's very unlikely you're going to hit anything with this in PvP, especially because the range is not great. In PvE, it's kind of surprisingly useful because it does a lot of posture damage. You can stagger enemies pretty well with this spell, and that can allow you to get a critical, or at the very least, if you're doing a pure casting run, you can get a long cast time spell off for free. Loretta's Great Bow. Kind of an interesting spell because of the large AoE. I think I'm going to give this an A, actually. The AoE that this creates on hit is sizable, in that AoE can catch people. If you're good at free aiming with this, I know Peeve actually has a video of him using this in PvP with his sorcery build with the Moonveil, where he free aims with this and catches people out. Pretty good. The damage is great too. You can cast it at your feet to catch people rolling in if they're not aware. In PvE, I believe this is the longest range spell in the game. And by that I mean it fizzles out at the furthest distance from you. Loretta's Mastery, I want to say the same thing about, but because it has not quite double the mana cost for not an incredible amount of damage more, I think I'm going to give it a high B. It does a lot of the same things that Loretta's Great Bow does, but it costs a lot more mana. Granted, it does do significantly more damage. In my opinion, though, this is harder to free aim because of how the arrows move. They do this interesting arc away from the center of the bow and then back towards the center. That can be interesting for aiming it at your feet. You get a larger AoE, but trying to do a long distance shot free aiming is not particularly easy with this, at least in my opinion. In PvE, it is, I think, a straight upgrade. It does have a much higher mana cost, but it does significantly more damage, and that can be the difference between having to cast another spell with an enemy running at you and one-shotting it. Next we have Lucidity. This gets a D. Do not use this spell. It is not good. You should be managing your status bars anyway. Not a whole lot, at least in PvE, inflicts madness or sleep, so you're probably not going to be encountering that. If you're fighting, for example, the frenzied rats in any of the infected villages, press the circle button and dodge. In PvP, there are people running around with sleep builds and frenzy builds, and the frenzy builds in particular are pretty decent, but again, press the circle button and dodge. If you're trying to cast this to lower your madness bar in PvP, you're probably not going to get it off, or if you do, you're going to get punished for it. Magic Downpour. I want to give this a D, but it's a high D. Magic Downpour is a lot like Crystal Release. Pretty easy to ignore. It just doesn't do that much damage. It does maybe a little bit of chip, and in PvP that can be useful. However, there are better options for that, like Swift Glintstone Shard or Ranker Call. So I'm going to give this a D. Do not use this spell. Magic Glint Blade. Oh, this is going in S. This is a high S. This spell is great. It does everything you need it to do. When you charge it, it has a greater delay than when you don't charge it, which means you can set up some really hard to dodge setups in PvP. It creates pressure because of the delayed projectile. It allows you to run at people and do combos if you're good at timing that hit. And in PvE, it does good damage, it has low mana cost, and enemies don't dodge it. If they're programmed to dodge a spell, they will dodge when you cast the sign, not when the projectile goes off, meaning they get hit by it anyway. This spell is great. It's good for everything. The Prisoner starts with this spell, I know, which makes it one of the better classes. Next we have Magma Shot. This is a pretty decent spell, to be entirely honest. Sometimes it can be useful to do fire damage instead of magic damage as a spellcaster, and this kind of fills that niche. The damage is not incredible.
The range is not incredible. However, it does have a little bit of AoE on hit, and that can make it useful. It does pretty decent damage against enemies that are strong against magic damage in particular. You are probably not going to hit anybody with this in PvP. I don't recommend trying it, but it's useful in PvE, and for that it gets a B. We have two Meteorite spells right next to each other. We have Meteorite of Estelle, and we have Standard Meteorite. We're going to give this one a low B. This spell does a lot of damage. The unfortunate thing is, none of the comets can be aimed at all. It's entirely random. And it costs a lot of mana to cast. So for that inconsistency, I don't know if I can recommend this for PvE or PvP, even though it does do so much damage. But it can pay off. In PvP, I don't think you're going to hit anybody with this unless you're very, very lucky. The Standard Meteorite spell, I think, is actually a lot more useful, and we're going to put it at the top of B. Unlike the Meteorite of Estelle, this one does lock in. It's slow enough that it can hit people even after they dodge, especially in PvE. If an enemy dodges and you're far enough away, the meteorites will still home in on them and hit them, and it does some good damage. In PvP, the AoE is really its saving grace. If the enemy mistimes their roll, they can get hit by the AoE of the spell impacting the ground, and that can make it slightly more useful. Much like the Meteorite of Estelle, though, this has a really long cast time. You can get hit out of it very quickly, especially if the enemy has any ranged options of their own. They don't even have to run up to hit you. They can just throw a dagger and stagger you out of it. And that's 30 mana down the drain. Next, we have Night Maiden's Mist. This is going to get a high C. And it's going to get a high C because this only has one use. This is only good for killing the Crystallians. This spell does good damage to them without staggering them. So you can cast the mist and then run around in a circle and watch them die. In PvP, unless maybe you're in a hallway and you can really force a choke that the enemy needs to run through, they can just step out of the cloud. It's not incredible. The damage isn't great. It doesn't stagger. It's just not particularly useful in PvP. Next we have another two that are very similar, Night Shard and Night Comet. Night Comet is just the more powerful version of Night Shard, so we're going to go ahead and put that one in, I guess we're going to say low B, and we're going to put this one in low C. The reason that these are not great is because functionally they are the same thing as the Glintstone shards. It says they're semi-invisible. They're very visible. You can see them. If you're going to use these, you should probably just use the Glintstone shard spells. They are boosted by the Staff of Loss. However, they're just outclassed. Next we have the Oracle Bubbles. This is kind of the same thing as the Great Oracular Bubble, except even worse. It has less range. It does less posture damage. It doesn't do very much actual damage. Not really worth using. If you are in a boss's face and you cast this into them, it can do some really good posture damage in the same way that when we were talking about Crystal Burst. If you are in a boss's face and you can land all those bubbles, it'll do a lot of posture damage to them, and cracking posture can be useful even for mages because you get a free spell off or you get a critical if you have a good weapon. In PvP, you're never going to hit this. It takes forever to cast. It has no range. And even if you do, it doesn't do any damage, and there's no posture critical in PvP, so that use isn't there either. Rancor Call. Much like Glintstone, Ice Crag, I love this spell, so there is some bias here. This is going to get a low A. Unfortunately, this spell does not do an incredible amount of damage. It doesn't do an incredible amount of posture damage. What it does do, it has very, very strong homing for a low mana cost and a low cast time. This is, in my opinion, the pressure PvP spell. If you cast this, the enemy has to run or take significant chip damage, and if it staggers them, they get comboed for free with Carian Slicer or any weapon or any fast spell. This spell is incredible for PvP. I highly recommend using it if you can afford the stat line. In PvE, probably not worth using, to be entirely honest. It doesn't do enough damage. It doesn't do enough posture damage. Its main strength is PvP. Next, we have the two moon spells, Rani's Dark Moon and Renala's Full Moon. The big difference with these is Rani's Dark Moon inflicts frost and does slightly less base damage. The issue with these in PvP is they are unbelievably slow, and the projectile is incredibly easy to dodge. These spells for PvP are doo-doo. They're not worth using. For PvE, though, they can be useful. They have a very high mana cost, they have very high intelligence requirements, which means not every build can use them. However, the AoE on landing is pretty good. But unfortunately, that's the only real use I can say for it. You can't really use it against the boss unless you're using a summon or a mimic to distract them. I'm gonna have to give both of these a high C. We're gonna put them under Night Maiden's Mist, though. Next, we have Rock Blaster. This is one of the Stone Digger sorceries, and this does a big AoE around your feet. It's kind of like the magic version of Godric's I Command Thee Kneel, Ash of War. It's pretty slow, and like most ground tremor attacks, it can be entirely countered by jumping over it. So not only is it slow, but it can also be jumped over. So for PvP, this is a no-go. Maybe on Wake Up, possibly, if you get a hard knockdown and someone has to get up, like after a backstab or a riposte, you might be able to get an Oki off with this. But it's not great, and we're gonna put it at the bottom of C, I think. And you know, while we're at it, we're gonna put the other Stone Digger sorcery, Shadow Earth, in there as well. They do pretty much the same thing, but that's the weaker version. Next we have Rock Sling, possibly one of the more useful gravity sorceries. It does a lot of posture damage, and that is its greatest boon, especially in PvE. If you cast this against a boss and all three of them hit, you probably only need a couple more hits to stagger them. In PvP, slightly less strong. If the 3 rocks went off in sequence, as in like a 1, 2, 3, maybe it would be better. Maybe you could catch people with it. It would make the roll required to dodge it a little more tight. As it is, it's pretty easy to dodge. The cast time is pretty slow. You can get staggered out of it, or, you know, the enemy can just run away. Posture damage is good, though, and I think for that reason, we're going to put it high B. Rykard's Rancor. This is kind of an interesting spell. It is boosted by the Magma Staff that you can find in Mount Gilmere in the Volcano Manor. It does pretty good damage and a pretty good AoE. The big downside to this spell is it does not home as strong as I want it to. In PvE, it can be useful because it explodes multiple times. You can get some good damage off with this against bigger enemies. In PvP, you're probably just not going to hit anybody with it, unfortunately. For its usefulness in PvE, I think we're gonna put it in high B. Scholar's Armament. This is your quintessential magic buff. This is pretty good. You can pump some good damage out of this spell. It does, you know, maybe it adds another 100 or so AR, gives a lot of mages a good option. Unfortunately, I do feel like Guardian Slicer is just the better combat spell. You should be using that instead of the buff, especially for the mana cost. If you are using a weapon and you would like to do some extra damage with it, this is pretty decent, and for that we're going to give it a mid-B, I think. Scholar's Shield is particularly strong in Elden Ring because of the new guard counter mechanic. Shields in general, blocking is very strong, especially in PvE. There are Ashes of War that I know people are abusing with shields, like Barricade Shield, which essentially entirely mitigates stamina usage when you block, as well as any chip damage. This does much the same thing. The really interesting thing about this spell is that it does not scale, which means if you're doing a low intelligence sword user, this can be pretty useful for you. In PvP, if you are doing a turtle build, like with an S-Stock, this can be useful for you. This is going to get a high B, I think. This might be at the top of B. Shard Spiral. Shard Spiral is a really cool spell, actually. It's very slow, it has very strong homing, and it can hit multiple times when it does hit something. And on top of that, the mana cost is very manageable. This is a great bread and butter PvE spell. If you hit someone with this, it's going to hurt them. It might not one-shot, but it'll hurt. If they dodge, it'll probably still home in on them because the homing is so strong on it. Well worth using for PvE. In PvP, surprisingly useful because of the homing. Unfortunately, the range is just not quite there. It doesn't chase the enemy long enough, but you can get some use out of it because the homing is strong. I am going to put it high B. Shattering Crystal is a cool spell. I like this spell a lot. Highly recommend that people use it. This is going to go, I think this is going to go high A, actually, next to Carian Phalanx. The reason this is so cool is not only does it do a lot of damage in PvE against big enemies if you hit them with the whole Shatter, it also is a great roll catch spell. Much like Carian Piercer, if you know someone is going to roll, for example, after you hit them with another spell, or after you hit them with a Sword Swing or Carian Slicer, you can swap to Shattering Crystal and get a really good roll catch off. Please, I can't recommend this enough, please pick up this spell. After the buff in 1.03, this spell became very strong. It does have a pretty hefty mana cost, however, it is absolutely worth using, worth adding to your arsenal. Starlight, this gets a D. Do not use this. It is kind of the magic equivalent to the belt loop lantern that you can buy from a lot of the nomadic merchants. It provides light in dark places. The benefit is that it provides a lot more light. It provides the equivalent of a full torch being held up to illuminate everything around you. The downside is it has a limited duration and it casts mana. If you're doing a slow exploration of a cave, you're probably going to have to cast this 2 or 3 times. And that's 24, 36 mana throughout the course of a cave. Just use the reusable one. Star Shower. We were talking about the star spells earlier, about how their strength is the homing. This is the straight upgrade, so this is going to go low B, I think. Maybe mid B. That feels about right. It does more damage for a higher mana cost. It still has the same benefits of the other star spells, where it homes in on enemies despite their AI dodge, but also like the previous star spells in PvP, it's pretty easy to dodge. All of the stars hit at the same time. It requires only 1 dodge roll to get through all of them. Stars of Ruin coming up next though, and this is very, very strong. This gets an S. Absolutely. This spell will, if you're doing a high intelligence build and you have the right magic damage boosting equipment, this can easily 4-shot bosses. It does incredible damage. It does decent but not great posture damage in PvE. It homes in on enemies. It doesn't matter if they dodge. You're going to hit Melania with this. It doesn't matter how much she dodges. It's incredible. It's great. In PvP, it does have a low cast time and it does cost a lot of mana. However, it's almost impossible to dodge without getting hit at least once. And it makes them spam dodge roll. You cast this spell to burn the enemy's stamina. And the less stamina the enemy has, the less aggressive they can be, the fewer swings they can do, the fewer spells they can cast, the less they can block. This spell is really good. It's worth using on any character that can use it. Highly recommend picking this up. Swift Glintstone Shard. This is also going to get an S for me. This is great in PvP and PvE. A lot of the benefits I talked about with Glintstone Pebble, Swift Glintstone Shard just does better. It has an even lower mana cost. It only costs 5 mana to cast this. You get so many casts, and if you are stacking intelligence, if you have a good sorcery scaling on your staff, it's still going to do good damage. It's going to do 200, maybe 300 damage per cast. That's non-trivial, and it's so quick. You can cast it out of rolls, you can cast it out of a dash. It combos into itself, and it works really well with spells that are slower to cast in PvP. If you are using Rancor Call to apply pressure, or Stars of Ruin to apply pressure and someone's dodging, or if they're running away, you can cast Swift Glintstone Shard and cast them out. The homing is decent, the damage is decent. It's worth using, it's worth having a slot, especially for the mana cost and the speed. Terra Magicus. This is maybe one of the best PvE spells in the game, and for that we're gonna give it a high A, or a mid A, I guess I would call it. Let's put it up here. This spell amps all of your magic damage. If your sword does magic damage, this will amp it. If your spells do magic damage, as in this will amp it. It is very, very strong when you're standing inside of this. It is part of the Comet Azure combo where you put this down, you chug your Flask of Wondrous Physic, and you press the Comet Azure button and one-shot a boss if they don't dodge. If you are against a boss that doesn't move that much, you can put this down and just spam into them with whatever spell or weapon that does magic damage, and it will boost it. It is a very significant boost, and it's very worth using. In PvP, it's a little less good. Unfortunately, the enemy can just run away. Thops' Barrier. This is kind of interesting. I think I'll put it next to Eternal Darkness. It fulfills much of the same role of Eternal Darkness. However, Eternal Darkness puts a field above your head that stays there. Thops' Barrier is more akin to a parry. It's useful. It doesn't cost a lot of mana. It doesn't cost a lot of stamina. The downside is just that it requires some timing. If you can successfully time the spell, though, it is incredible for countering enemy magicians in both PvE and PvP. Tibia's Summons. This is a low C. This is barely usable. It doesn't do a lot of damage. It has a weird stat line requiring both intelligence and faith. It has a long cast time, and the hitboxes are really inconsistent. Even with big enemies, sometimes you won't hit all of the slashes with this, and you'll be wondering why you decided to use it. In PvP, you're also never going to hit anybody with this. Unseen Blade. This is going to get a mid-C. The reason this is going to get a mid-C is because despite being entirely useless in PvE, because the AI does not care whether your weapon is invisible or not, in PvP, it can be interesting because it can disguise what weapon you're holding. And if you're casting a lot of spells, they can be caught off guard because they don't know what the moveset of the weapon is. So it can be good for some mind games. Other than that, it's not incredible. Unseen Form. This is going to go right next to it. Kind of the opposite. In PvP, it's absolutely useless. But in PvE, this is great for sneaking. If you're doing a stealth playthrough, if you're trying to get through some nasty tunnels or something without being seen, this can be really helpful for that. In PvP, it's useless. Don't use it. And Zamor Ice Storm. This is kind of interesting. It takes a long time to cast. And if, at least in PvP, if the enemy has poise, if they don't get staggered by this, you're opening yourself up to a free backstab, and that's not good. The benefit is that it does frost damage, which means it can proc frost. If it does proc frost, that will be a stagger. It doesn't cost a huge amount of mana, and the AoE is pretty wide. In PvE, you can hit a pretty good amount of enemies with this just because the AoE is so large. And for those reasons, I think we're gonna put it in low B. It's definitely usable. All right, and that is the sorcery tier list. And if you have any opinions, if you disagree, if you agree, please let me know. Leave a comment for me. All right, thank you all for watching, and have a wonderful day.